Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into the pretty wild history of language teaching. We're going to look at how we went from, memorizing ancient grammar rules to actually trying to have a conversation, and why your language class is probably worlds away from the one your parents took.
I mean, really think about it for a second. Was your class full of games, role-playing, and talking to your classmates? Or was it more about silent memorization and filling out worksheets? This question is actually at the very heart of a huge, century-long debate about the best way to learn a language. All right, let's get into it.
So, our story kicks off with the oldest kid on the block, the grammar translation method. This was the original, the classic. It grew out of how people studied languages like Latin and Greek, and for a really, really long time, this was basically the only way it was done.
And here's a quick look at the journey we're about to take. We start way back in the 1800s with grammar translation. Then we'll see a huge pushback in the early 1900s, get a very serious kickstart from the military around the 50s, get a little groovy in the 70s, and then land on the much more familiar approaches we see today.
So what did one of these classes actually look like? Well, it was a super systematic, almost factory-like process. First, you'd learn a grammar rule. Then, you'd memorize a long list of words that had nothing to do with each other. And your main job? Just translate, and then translate some more. The entire class was taught in your own language, and the whole point wasn't to, say, order a coffee in Rome, but to be able to read classic literature. Speaking? Yeah, that was barely even on the radar.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. This was the method's biggest weakness. It made people who were experts at analyzing a language, who could pick apart a sentence perfectly on paper, but they'd completely freeze up if you asked them a simple question on the street. Something had to change.
And that change came as a massive revolution. The pendulum just swung hard in the complete opposite direction, away from the textbook and towards actual spoken conversation.
And the difference was just night and day. It was a total 180. The direct method, championed by guys like Charles Berlitz, basically threw out the old rulebook. First off, no more using your native language. The class was only in the language you were learning. Instead of memorizing grammar rules, you were supposed to just absorb them, figure them out from context, kind of like how a little kid does. And translation? Nope, absolutely forbidden. The whole idea was to copy how we learn our very first language.
Now, this big push for speaking got a huge and pretty unexpected boost from world history. When World War II broke out, the US military had a problem. They needed soldiers and spies who could actually speak other languages, and they needed them to learn fast. They didn't have time for theory. They needed people to be able to talk, and they needed it yesterday.
So, this Army method eventually turned into what's known as the Audiolingual Method. And its core belief was simple. Learning a language is all about forming habits. The whole point was to drill these good habits into your brain through endless repetition, so speaking becomes automatic. Think of it like building muscle memory, but for your mouth.
And this is what it looked like in action. The teacher would say a sentence, give a cue like question, and the whole class would chant the new sentence back, again and again and again. Now the problem? It was actually pretty good for memorizing patterns, but it didn't teach you how to have a real spontaneous conversation. You could end up sounding like a perfectly programmed robot, but you'd be lost if the conversation went off script.
And that mechanical, robotic feeling led to the next big reaction. In the 1970s, you get this humanistic wave, which turned the focus away from just drills and patterns and looked inward, to the mind, the feelings, and the psychology of the person learning.
And this wave brought some pretty wild ideas. First up, the silent way. Just imagine a language class where the teacher hardly says a word. Instead, they use gestures and these special color-coded charts to represent sounds. The idea was that the students had to become language detectives and discover the rules of the language all on their own.
Then there's Suggestopedia, which honestly sounds more like a spa day than a language class. The theory here was all about psychology. You'd have comfy chairs, dim lighting, even classical music playing, all to get students into this super relaxed, suggestible state. The goal was to lower their stress and anxiety so they could just absorb huge amounts of vocabulary without even trying.
And rounding out this trio is Total Physical Response, or TPR. This method is all about moving your body. The teacher gives simple commands like stand up or walk to the door, and the students just do the action. It's based on how toddlers learn. They understand way more than they can say. The best part is it's totally stress-free because you don't have to say a single word until you feel ready.
So, after all these experiments, from silent teachers to classical music, the focus finally started to sharpen around one powerful central idea: The whole point of learning a language is to communicate.
This led to what we call Communicative Language Teaching, or CLT, and this is probably going to sound really familiar to a lot of you. The focus is on using the language to get things done in the real world. This is when teachers started bringing in real stuff, like newspaper articles and restaurant menus. And, really importantly, making mistakes was seen as totally normal, even necessary. Being able to get your point across was just as important as having perfect grammar.
And a really popular way of doing this is something called task-based learning. Here, the whole lesson is built around completing a real task, like planning a trip with a partner or figuring out a train schedule. The language you need to learn just comes up naturally as you try to solve the problem.
So, this brings us to the million-dollar question. After this long, winding journey with all these different ideas and methods, did we finally figure it out? Have we found the one single perfect way to learn a language? Well, the answer, maybe surprisingly, is no. Turns out the whole search for one best method was kind of a wild goose chase. A lot of these methods became popular because of academic trends, or even because there was money to be made selling the books. And what's more, context is everything. What works for a group of adults in Canada might completely fail with a class of kids in Japan.
So where does all of this leave us today? Well, it leaves us with a much smarter and more flexible idea. It's not about finding one magic wand, it's about building a great toolbox.
This modern approach is called principled eclecticism, and the big idea here is that a great teacher doesn't just stick to one method. They're like a chef who knows all the recipes. They make smart, informed choices, pulling techniques from all the methods we've talked about. So they might use a quick drill from the Audiolingual Method to practice a tough sound, then immediately switch to a fun role-playing activity from CLT, all based on what the students need in that exact moment.
And you know what? This approach just plain works. Why? Well, for one, the variety keeps students way more engaged. It's also incredibly flexible, so the teacher can adapt to any classroom situation. And by using a mix of strategies, it's just a safer bet. You're increasing the chances that something is going to click for every single student. And that's really the big takeaway from this entire history. The goal was never about finding the one perfect hammer that could do every single job. The goal was to build a rich, diverse toolbox so a teacher has exactly the right tool for whatever learning challenge comes their way.
So that leaves us with a final question for you to chew on. Whether you're learning a language or music or really any new skill, what works for you? What kind of tools do you have in your own personal learning toolbox?